I want to talk about the blood. So I went through this whole thing about inflammation to get to this part right here to tell you that in any type of situation where you have inflammation, like in a chronic disorder or a disease, your bone marrow is going to be affected. Now, here's what I want you to know. What is special about the bone marrow? Well, at any given moment, the bone marrow itself is where you have a whole lot of cells turning over. At any moment in time, you've got a lot of cells in your bone marrow. What kind of cells? What kind of cells are created and start off or hang out in the bone marrow? Well, we have, for instance, we have red blood cells, we have white blood cells, we have platelets, right? And we have other cell types. We have B cells and T cells. We have all types of cells. So for instance, if you go to the heart, you've got heart cells. If you go to the liver, you've got liver cells. But in the bone marrow, you got all kind of cells. You got, like I said, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, B and T lymphocytes, and so forth, right? So you have lots of kind of cells hanging out there at any moment in time. If your bone marrow starts to get suppressed, if your bone marrow is not working properly, now you're going to have all kinds of problems. Let's go back to the screen. So what I just said is in the bone marrow, for instance, you have white blood cells, you have red blood cells, you have platelets, and then you have all types of other cells. Now, when it comes to the blood, if I were to take some blood, right? Let's take a cup of blood. What's in that cup of blood? Well, right now it's all kind of mixed together, right? But what if I take that, send it to the lab, and centrifuge it, right? So I spin it around. So what's going to happen? Now everything's going to kind of separate. And so this is exactly what happens. Let's say I take a tube of blood and I spin it, I centrifuge it. So once it starts to separate, we're going to have, for instance, down at the bottom, we're going to have a whole bunch of red blood cells. And the way you remember this in terms of what's going to be on the bottom, well, for instance, one of the lab tests that we look at, let's pop me up on the, okay. One of the lab tests we look at is something called the ESR, the erythrocyte, red blood cell, erythrocyte sedimentation rate. So this is, for instance, if I were to drop a red blood cell, how long does it take to settle toward the bottom? The rate at which it settles is called the erythrocyte sedimentation rate. So just think about that. We have a lab test that determines how quickly red blood cells settle. So for instance, the red blood cells are going to settle toward the bottom. Everybody good with that? Okay. Now, so let's just draw this in. Let's just label this for you. So we have, for instance, red blood cells down at the bottom. Then let's draw your attention to this next little layer. This is what's called the buffy coat. The buffy coat. So let's write that in. We have what's called the buffy coat. Okay. Now, what is the buffy coat? Well, the buffy coat consists of, for instance, white blood cells, and it also consists of platelets. All right, what did I say? The buffy coat consists of what two things? White blood cells and platelets, okay? And then the third thing that we have is we have what's known as the plasma. You've heard of plasma. People donate plasma, for instance. Well, what is the plasma? The plasma is the fluid portion of the blood that contains mostly water. It's about 90% water, but it also contains protein. It contains electrolytes. There are other components that are kind of mixed in with the plasma, but it's mostly water. It also has things like antibodies. It has other cells, other immune cells, and that kind of thing. So when it comes to the blood, we have what are called formed elements, and then we have the fluid. The fluid portion is called plasma, and then the formed elements are going to be red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets primarily, okay? Now, the plasma makes up about 55% of the blood volume, and then the formed elements make up the rest. So we have fluid part, that's called plasma, and then the formed elements, what three things make that up? We have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, for instance, okay? So let's go back over that one more time. What I said is if you take a tube of blood, spin it, what's at the bottom is going to be the red blood cells. Then we're going to have this buffy coat here. The buffy coat consists of white blood cells and platelets. And then we have this plasma, that's the fluid part with the rest of the protein, electrolytes, other cell types. Okay, you good with that part? Now, here's where I want to go. So let's say something comes in, you got this disorder, you got a disease, and it wipes out, or maybe you're using certain medications. We'll talk about that. Maybe you have some kind of infection, or there's so many things that could actually wipe out your bone marrow. But let's say something came along and knocks out your bone marrow. Well, if I don't make red blood cells, that's going to lead to a problem. If I don't make white blood cells, that's another problem. If I don't make platelets, that's another problem. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's talk about that. If I don't make red blood cells, what's that called? That's going to be, for instance, anemia. Now, we're going to talk, and I'm just going to introduce this, go over the big picture, and then I'm going to go deep into all of these. Okay, you ready? So, if I don't have red blood cells, we said that's anemia. If I don't have white blood cells, what do you think that's called? Okay. If I don't make white blood cells by themselves, so the whole category of white blood cells, that's called, let's change my color there. That's called leukopenia. Okay. If I don't have enough red blood cells, that's anemia. If I don't have enough white blood cells, that's leukopenia. Now, what do you think we're going to call it if I don't make enough platelets, for instance? If I don't make enough platelets, that's going to be called thrombocytopenia. Okay? So we can have anemia, we can have leukemia, we can have thrombocytopenia. Okay? Everybody good with that? Does that make sense? Now, what if I don't have all of them? What if I don't make red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets? So if I have anemia, leukopenia, and thrombocytopenia, what's the term for that? The term for when I don't have enough of any other good stuff? That's called pancytopenia. So pan, of course, means all. When I have a decrease in the number of all cell types, that's pancytopenia. Okay. So what we just said is any kind of chronic problem can lead to bone marrow problems, and that can lead to anemia. It can lead to leukopenia. It can lead to thrombocytopenia, right? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to break those down and go further into each of those cell types. All right, stay with me. And by the way, type in your question if you have a question. And I will get back to the questions. I'll try to answer you as quickly as possible. So let's go back to the screen.